The earth still felt fresh beneath Jacob Zell's boots as he stood under the gnarled oak tree, his weathered hands gripping his hat against his chest. 6 months had passed since he'd buried Emma there, but the hollow ache in his chest felt as raw as the day she'd drawn her final breath in his arms. It was 1875 in the territory of Wyoming, and death was no stranger to these parts. But losing Emma to childbirth, losing both her and their unborn son on that terrible spring night, had nearly broken him beyond repair. Jacob traced the simple wooden cross with his fingertips, noting how the elements were already beginning to weather it. He'd have to carve a proper one soon, something lasting. Something worthy of the woman who'd followed him out to this unforgiving frontier with nothing but hope and love in her heart. He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't hear the approaching footsteps until they were nearly upon him. "I hope you don't mind," came a gentle voice. Jacob turned to find Grace Collins standing a respectful distance away, clutching a small bunch of wildflowers. She was the widow who'd moved into the neighboring homestead last winter. Though they'd exchanged pleasantries at the general store in town, they were hardly more than acquaintances. "Just thought she might like some color," Grace added, gesturing to the grave with the flowers. Jacob nodded, his throat too tight for words. He stepped back, allowing her to approach the grave. There was something both painful and comforting in watching another person tend to Emma's resting place. Grace knelt down, carefully arranging the flowers at the base of the cross before stepping back. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," she said quietly. "Back in Missouri, influenza took him in less than a week. Sometimes I think the suddenness was a mercy." Jacob found his voice at last. "Emma was in labor for 3 days before." He couldn't finish the sentence. "The doctor from town couldn't make it through the spring floods." Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'll leave you be." "Thank you for the flowers," Jacob managed. "I'll bring more next week, if that's all right." Jacob nodded, watching as she walked back across the meadow that separated their properties. Her figure was silhouetted against the setting sun, her simple calico dress catching the golden light. For the briefest moment, he felt something other than grief. Not happiness, he wasn't sure he'd ever feel that again, but perhaps the faintest whisper of peace. True to her word, Grace returned the following week with fresh flowers, and the week after that. Sometimes they exchanged a few words, other times they simply stood in companionable silence. Jacob found himself watching for her across the meadow, wondering what colors she might bring each time. By mid-autumn, Jacob had crafted a proper cross of oak, carved with Emma's name and the dates of her brief life. Grace had been there when he'd set it in place, holding steady the base while he tamped down the earth around it. "It's beautiful," she'd said, tracing the carved letters with her fingertips. She would have loved it. Winter came early that year, harsh and unforgiving. The first heavy snowfall blanketed the countryside in white, making travel between homesteads treacherous. Jacob found himself checking the horizon, but Grace didn't appear on her usual day. He tried not to feel disappointed. After all, he hardly knew the woman. She owed him nothing. 3 days later, Jacob spotted smoke rising from her chimney that didn't look right, too thin, too sporadic. Concern gnawed at him as he saddled his horse and rode across the frozen meadow. He found Grace huddled by a dying fire, her face flushed with fever. The wood pile by her hearth was nearly depleted. "I'm fine," she insisted weakly. "Just need to rest a spell." Jacob ignored her protests, quickly building up the fire before heading out to chop more wood. By nightfall, he had stocked her woodpile, prepared a simple broth from provisions in her pantry, and settled in a chair by her bedside. "You don't have to stay," she murmured, her voice faint. "I know," he replied simply. For 3 days, Jacob barely left her side, riding back to his own homestead only to tend to his animals before returning. On the 4th day, Grace's fever broke and he found her sitting up, her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders, a tentative smile on her pale face. "You saved my life," she said. Jacob shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Neighbors look out for each other out here, that's all." Well, I'm mighty grateful all the same. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I never thought I'd make it out here alone, you know. After John died, everyone said I was crazy to take up his dream of heading west. Jacob nodded, understanding all too well. Emma was the same way. Braver than me, truth be told. I wanted to stay back east, work in my father's smithy. She's the one who kept talking about open skies and land of our own. A comfortable silence fell between them. Jacob realized it was the first time he'd spoken Emma's name without feeling that knife twist of pain. I'd best get back, he said finally, but I'll check on you tomorrow. Grace nodded. I'll be back on my feet by then, and Jacob, thank you. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something about the way it sounded in her gentle voice stayed with him all the way back to his empty cabin. As Grace recovered, a new rhythm established itself. Jacob would find reasons to ride over to her homestead, a loose board that needed fixing, a stubborn well pump, a missing cow that had wandered onto his property. Grace, in turn, would sometimes appear at his door with a freshly baked pie or loaf of bread, always with some practical excuse about having made too much for just herself. And every Sunday, without fail, they would meet at Emma's grave beneath the oak tree. Grace never missed a week, even when the winter winds howled across the plains. "Why do you do it?" Jacob finally asked one bitterly cold January day. "You never even knew her." Grace was quiet for a long moment, adjusting the evergreen boughs she'd brought in place of flowers. "When John died, there was no grave for me to visit. We were traveling and there wasn't time." She straightened, meeting his eyes. "I like to think someone might be doing this for him wherever he rests. And besides," she added softly, "it helps to have a place to put your grief." Jacob nodded, understanding dawning. "Would you like to tell me about him? John, I mean." Grace's smile was sad but genuine. "I'd like that very much." They began walking back toward his cabin, their breaths creating clouds in the frigid air as Grace spoke of the man she'd loved and lost. For the first time, Jacob found himself listening to another's grief without being consumed by his own. By the time spring returned to the Wyoming territory, something had shifted between Jacob and Grace. Their Sunday meetings at Emma's grave remained, but they'd added other routines as well: shared meals, reading aloud to each other in the evenings, working side by side to prepare their fields for planting. One warm April evening, as they sat on Jacob's porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues, Grace's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they'd been doing this for years. "I've been thinking," Jacob said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "My fields and yours, they'd be easier to work together, more efficient." Grace looked at him, understanding the question beneath his words. "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Zell?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Not exactly, Mrs. Collins." "Then what exactly are you proposing?" Her eyes held a challenge, but he could see the hope there too. "I'm proposing that I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore." He squeezed her hand. "I know it hasn't been that long since Jacob," she interrupted gently. "Time doesn't heal all wounds. Some just become part of who we are. I will always carry John with me, just as you will always carry Emma." "And you think there's room for something new? For us?" Grace smiled, the last rays of sunlight catching in her eyes. "I think Emma would be the first to tell you that hearts are built for loving. They expand to make room." Jacob leaned forward, hesitant, until Grace closed the distance between them. Their first kiss was gentle, questioning, and then deeper, more certain. When they finally pulled apart, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he confessed. "Neither did I." Grace touched his cheek. "But here we are." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in town, with only the minister and a few neighbors as witnesses. That evening, as the stars appeared one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, Jacob led Grace to the oak tree. "I wanted to tell her," he explained as they stood before Emma's grave. "It felt right." Grace nodded, taking his hand. "Hello, Emma," she said softly. "I promise I'll take good care of him. and I'll keep bringing you flowers every week." As they walked back to the cabin that would now be their shared home, Jacob felt a lightness in his step that had been absent for too long. The grief was still there, it always would be, but now it was accompanied by something else. Something that felt remarkably like hope. The seasons turned, and their life together found its rhythm. They worked the combined fields, built up their herd of cattle, and made improvements to Jacob's cabin, which was now their home. Grace had sold her smaller homestead to a young family newly arrived from Pennsylvania. Every Sunday, without fail, they visited Emma's grave together. Sometimes Jacob would tell stories about his first wife, funny anecdotes or cherished memories, and Grace would listen, occasionally adding stories of her own about John. The oak tree grew stronger with each passing year, its branches reaching higher into the Wyoming sky. It was beneath that tree, on a warm summer evening in 1877, that Grace told Jacob she was with child. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice tight with both joy and fear. She nodded, understanding his apprehension. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. He says I'm healthy and strong, Jacob. This isn't like before." Jacob placed a tentative hand on her still flat stomach, his eyes filled with wonder and trepidation. "I can't lose you too, Grace." "I couldn't bear it." "You won't," she promised, covering his hand with her own. "We're going to be a family, Jacob, you, me, and this little one." As Grace's pregnancy progressed, Jacob's anxiety grew. He insisted on hiring help for the harvest, refusing to let Grace strain herself. He rode into town weekly to check if the doctor had returned from his circuit of the outlying homesteads. He even began building an addition to their cabin, a proper bedroom for the baby, with a large window to let in the morning light. "You're going to wear yourself ragged before this child even arrives," Grace chided him one evening as he came in from working long after sunset. "I just want everything to be ready," he said, washing his hands in the basin. Grace moved behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, her rounded belly pressing against his back. "We're ready, Jacob, whatever happens." But as her time grew near, Jacob's nightmares returned, dreams of blood-soaked sheets and Emma's pale face, of tiny coffins and freshly turned earth. He would wake gasping, reaching for Grace to reassure himself that she was still there, still breathing beside him. On a crisp November morning, Grace's labor began. Jacob sent their hired hand, young Tom Preston, galloping toward town to fetch the doctor, while he boiled water and prepared the bedroom as Grace had instructed him weeks before. "It's going to be fine," Grace kept telling him between increasingly painful contractions. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. But as the hours passed and Grace's pain intensified, Jacob found himself pacing outside their bedroom door, memories of Emma's tortured screams echoing in his mind. When he could bear it no longer, he saddled his horse and rode to the oak tree. "I can't lose her too," he said to the wooden cross that marked Emma's grave. "I'm not strong enough, Em. I wasn't strong enough to save you, and I'm afraid I won't be strong enough to save her either." The wind rustled through the oak's nearly bare branches, sending a shower of golden leaves spiraling down around him. Jacob picked one up, turning it over in his hand. "She saved me, you know," he continued softly. After I lost you, I was just going through the motions. Existing, not living. And then she started bringing you those flowers, and somehow she brought me back to life too." He placed the oak leaf gently at the base of the cross. "If you can hear me, Emma, if you're out there somewhere, help me, help her, please." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him turn. It was Tom Preston, riding hard across the meadow. "Mr. Zell," the young man called. "The doctor's with Mrs. Zell now. He sent me to find you. It's time." Jacob's heart lurched as he mounted his horse. With one last glance at the oak tree, he whispered, "Thank you," and then rode as if the devil himself were on his heels. He arrived to find Dr. Miller emerging from the bedroom, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Congratulations, Mr. Zell," the doctor said with a tired smile. "You have a daughter. A healthy, strong-lunged daughter." Jacob stared at him, hardly daring to believe, and Grace, exhausted but well, she's asking for you. On shaking legs, Jacob entered the bedroom. Grace lay propped against the pillows, her face pale but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. I told you we'd be fine, she said, her voice weak but triumphant. Come meet your daughter. Jacob approached the bed cautiously, as if in a dream. Grace shifted the blanket to reveal a tiny face, eyes screwed shut, a dusting of dark hair on the perfect head. She's beautiful, he breathed, carefully sitting on the edge of the bed. Like her mother, Grace smiled, touching the baby's cheek. I thought we might call her Emma Jean, after both of them, if that's all right with you. Jacob's vision blurred with tears as he nodded. I think that's perfect. As he looked at his wife and daughter, his new family, Jacob felt a peace settle over him. The grief would always be there, a shadow in his heart, but it no longer defined him. Life had given him a second chance at happiness, and he intended to embrace every moment of it. The following Sunday, Jacob and Grace bundled little Emma Jean against the November chill and walked together to the oak tree. Grace carried a small bouquet of late-blooming asters. I brought someone to meet you, Jacob said softly as they stood before the grave. This is Emma Jean. Named for you and for Grace's John. Grace placed the flowers at the base of the cross, then took the baby from Jacob's arms so he could have a moment alone. He knelt in the fallen leaves, his hand resting on the weathered wood. Thank you, he whispered, for everything. For the time we had together, and for somehow leading Grace to me. I'll make sure our daughter knows about you, how brave you were, how much you loved these wide open spaces. He stood, brushing the leaves from his knees, and turned to Grace and their daughter. The sun broke through the clouds at that moment, bathing them in golden light. Ready to go home? Grace asked, adjusting the blanket around Emma Jean's face. Jacob nodded, taking her free hand in his. Home sounds just about perfect. As the years passed, Jacob and Grace built a life together that was rich with both joy and the bittersweet memory of those they'd lost. Emma Jean grew into a curious, adventurous girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's gentle smile. When she was 4, a brother joined their family, Samuel Jacob, a sturdy boy with a mischievous glint in his eye that reminded Grace of her first husband. The oak tree flourished, its branches spreading wider with each passing year, offering shade in summer and shelter from winter winds. Grace continued her weekly visits, often with the children in tow. Emma Jean would place wildflowers on the grave while Grace told her stories about the woman she was named for. Was she pretty, Mama? Emma Jean would ask. Very pretty, Grace would answer, glancing at Jacob. With a smile that could light up the darkest day. By 1885, their homestead had grown into a prosperous ranch. They'd added more land, built a larger house, and hired several hands to help with the expanding herd. Jacob had become a respected figure in the community, serving on the town council and helping to establish the region's first proper school. One warm September evening, as they sat on their wide front porch watching Emma Jean and Samuel play in the yard, Grace took Jacob's hand. Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out? She asked. If I hadn't brought those flowers that first day, Jacob squeezed her hand. I try not to dwell on what ifs, but I thank God every day that you did. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. I was so nervous. I'd seen you in town a few times, looking so lost. Everyone talked about the tragedy, the young wife who died in childbirth. I just wanted to do something, anything, to ease that kind of pain. You did more than that, Jacob said softly. You showed me it was possible to live again, not just exist. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The years had been kind to them, both a few more lines around the eyes, a touch of silver at Jacob's temples, but they wore their age well, like badges of a life fully lived. Mama, Papa. Look what I caught. Emma Jean came running up the porch steps, cupping something carefully in her hands. She opened them to reveal a glowing firefly, its light pulsing gently in the twilight. It's beautiful, sweetheart, Grace said, but remember what we talked about. Some things aren't meant to be kept. Emma Jean nodded solemnly. They need to be free. She walked to the edge of the porch and opened her hands, watching as the firefly rose into the darkening sky, its light blinking until it disappeared among the emerging stars. "Just like the flowers for your first wife," she said, turning back to Jacob. "We don't keep them. We just bring them to say hello and then let them go." Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion as he pulled his daughter into a hug. "That's exactly right, Emma Jean, that's exactly right." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Jacob found Grace standing by the window, looking out toward the oak tree, visible as a darker shadow against the star-strewn sky. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I was thinking about how lucky we are," she said, leaning back against him. "To have found each other in this vast wilderness, to have built this life together." Jacob kissed the top of her head. "It wasn't just luck, Grace, it was courage, your courage to approach a grieving man with flowers. My courage to let go of the past enough to see the future standing right in front of me." Grace turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his. "Do you think they know, Emma and John, do you think they can see how happy we are?" "I like to think so," Jacob said. "And I like to think they're happy for us." Grace reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar lines around his eyes. "I love you, Jacob Zell, more with each passing day, and I love you, Grace Zell, more than I ever thought possible." Their kiss was tender, filled with the comfortable passion of a love that had grown steadily stronger through the years, tempered by shared joys and sorrows, by the day-to-day work of building a life together. As they prepared for bed, Jacob found himself thinking about the twisted path that had led them here. How the worst day of his life standing over Emma's fresh grave had somehow, eventually, led to this abundance of happiness. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something new and equally precious. Life in the Wyoming territory continued to change around them. The railroad came through the nearby town, bringing more settlers, more commerce. The open range was increasingly divided by fences as the era of the free-ranging cowboy began to wane. Their children grew, attended the school their father had helped establish, and began to dream their own dreams. Emma Jean, now 12, showed a remarkable talent with horses, gentling even the most spirited colts with her patient, intuitive approach. Samuel, at 8, was fascinated by the mechanics of the new steam-powered equipment appearing on neighboring ranches. Constantly taking things apart to see how they worked through it all, Grace maintained her weekly visits to the oak tree. Sometimes Jacob accompanied her, other times she went alone or with the children. It had become such an established ritual that neighbors and ranch hands knew not to disturb Mrs. Zell on Sunday afternoons unless it was truly urgent. In the spring of 1890, as the oak tree burst into fresh green leaf, a letter arrived that would change the course of their lives once again. It was from Jacob's younger brother in Boston, whom he hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. "He's ill," Jacob told Grace after reading the letter. "Consumption. The doctors don't think he'll last the year." Grace sat beside him at the kitchen table, her hand covering his. "You should go to him." Jacob nodded, still staring at the letter. "He's the only family I have left besides you and the children. But I hate the thought of leaving you all, even for a few weeks." "Then don't," Grace said simply. "We'll come with you. The children have never seen the East, and I admit I'm curious about the city you grew up in." Jacob looked up, surprised. "You do that?" "Leave the ranch in the middle of spring," Grace smiled. "The ranch won't fall apart without us for a month or two. Tom Preston is more than capable of managing things in your absence. And family is family, Jacob. Your brother needs you." 2 weeks later, they boarded the eastbound train. Emma Jean and Samuel pressed against the windows, wide-eyed with excitement at their first journey beyond Wyoming. As the train pulled away from the station, Jacob caught a glimpse of the distant oak tree on the horizon, standing tall against the bright blue sky. Boston was a shock to the system after the open spaces of Wyoming. The noise, the crowds, the sheer verticality of the buildings overwhelmed them all at first. But the children quickly adapted, fascinated by the gaslights, the streetcars, the endless variety of people and goods. Jacob's brother, David, lived in a handsome brownstone in the Back Bay, attended by a housekeeper and a nurse. His illness had left him gaunt and weak, but his mind was as sharp as ever, and he delighted in getting to know his niece and nephew. "You've done well for yourself, big brother," David said one evening as they sat in his study, the sounds of Grace playing the piano with the children drifting up from the parlor below. "A beautiful wife, 2 wonderful children, a successful ranch, it's more than I ever managed." Jacob sipped his brandy, studying his brother's pale face. "It wasn't always so, you know about Emma." David nodded. "I received your letter. I should have come then, but the business was at a critical juncture and I thought there would be time later." He trailed off, regret in his eyes. "It's in the past," Jacob said, "and if I've learned anything in these years, it's that dwelling on what might have been only steals joy from what is." David smiled weakly. "When did my impulsive older brother become so philosophical?" "Around the time a widow with wildflowers showed up at my wife's grave," Jacob replied with a small smile of his own. They stayed in Boston for 6 weeks, longer than planned, as David's condition deteriorated more rapidly than expected. Grace proved a natural at navigating the complexities of Boston society, charming David's business associates and neighbors with her genuine warmth and quiet confidence. Emma Jean and Samuel thrived in the city environment, absorbing new experiences with the resilience of youth. They visited museums and libraries, attended their first theatrical performance, and developed a taste for ice cream from the parlor down the street. When the end came for David, it was peaceful, a quiet slipping away in the night with Jacob at his bedside. They buried him in the family plot beside their parents in a ceremony attended by what seemed like half of Boston's business community. He was well respected, Jacob commented to Grace as they returned to the brownstone after the funeral, and well loved, she added. "Did you see his housekeeper?" She was heartbroken. The revelation of David's will brought another surprise. He had left everything to Jacob, the brownstone, his successful shipping business, his considerable financial assets. It was more wealth than Jacob had ever imagined possessing. "What will you do with it all?" Grace asked as they lay in bed that night, the unfamiliar sounds of the city filtering through the window. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that. We could stay here, you know. The children would have advantages we can't give them in Wyoming: better schools, culture, opportunities." Grace propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the dim light. "Is that what you want, to return to city life?" Jacob sighed, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I want what's best for our family. I've seen how the children have flourished here, how easily you've adapted." "And you," Grace pressed. "Would you be happy here, Jacob, away from the land you've worked with your own hands, away from the open sky and—" she hesitated. "Away from Emma's resting place," the question hung between them. Jacob took Grace's hand, tracing the calluses that years of ranch work had left there. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted. "About what it would mean to leave her there. But then I realized something, Grace. Emma isn't really there beneath that oak tree, she's here." He touched his heart. "Just as your John is with you, we carry them with us wherever we go." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "That's true, but that doesn't answer my question. Would you be happy here, Jacob?" He considered her words carefully before answering. "I think I could be with you and the children, but the truth is I've come to love our life in Wyoming. The challenges, the freedom, the community we've built, that's our home now." Grace's smile was radiant in the darkness. "I was hoping you'd say that. But," Jacob continued, "that doesn't mean we can't use David's legacy to create something good. I've had an idea I wanted to discuss with you." They talked long into the night, making plans, reimagining their future. By morning, a new path had taken shape, one that would honor both their past and their hopes for their children's future. They returned to Wyoming as summer was reaching its peak, the prairie a riot of wildflowers and tall grasses. The ranch had fared well under Tom Preston's management, and the familiar routines of ranch life quickly reasserted themselves. The first Sunday after their return, the entire family made the walk to the oak tree. Emma Jean had insisted on gathering wildflowers along the way, her arms full of black-eyed Susans and prairie clover. "Hello, Mrs. Emma," she said solemnly as she arranged the flowers at the base of the cross. "We went all the way to Boston and saw the ocean and buildings taller than trees. But I missed you and our Sunday visits." Jacob felt Grace's hand slip into his as they watched their daughter. Samuel hung back a bit, suddenly shy in this ritual that had been a part of his life since birth. "It feels right to be back," Grace said softly. Jacob nodded. "I know we made the right decision." And they had. Over the next year, they put David's inheritance to work in ways that would benefit both their family and the community they'd come to love. They established a scholarship fund to send promising local students back east for education. They donated funds to build a proper hospital in the growing town, ensuring that no woman would again face childbirth without medical care due to distance or weather. And they set aside land adjacent to their ranch for what would become the Emma Zell School for Girls, an institution dedicated to providing young women with both practical skills and academic knowledge, in an era when female education was often an afterthought. When the school opened its doors in the fall of 1892, Grace served as its first headmistress, bringing to the position her natural grace and formidable intelligence. Jacob, meanwhile, continued to run the ranch while taking an increasing interest in territorial politics, advocating for the rights of small ranchers as Wyoming transitioned toward statehood. Emma Jean, now 14, divided her time between her studies and her beloved horses, developing a breeding program that would eventually produce some of the finest cutting horses in the territory. Samuel threw himself into his education with unexpected enthusiasm after discovering a natural aptitude for mathematics and engineering. Life wasn't without its challenges. The winter of '93 was particularly harsh, bringing blizzards that decimated cattle herds across the region. The following summer saw a drought that tested even the most experienced ranchers. But through it all, the Zell family persevered, their bonds strengthening through adversity. Every Sunday, without fail, Grace continued her visits to the oak tree. As the years passed and her chestnut hair began to show streaks of silver, she occasionally went alone, seeking the peaceful solitude beneath the spreading branches. "I still talk to her, you know," she confessed to Jacob one evening in 1895 as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the rolling prairie. "After all these years, I tell her about our life, about the children. Sometimes I even ask her advice." Jacob smiled, taking her hand. "And does she answer?" Grace's eyes twinkled. "Not in words, but sometimes when the wind moves through the oak leaves just right, I fancy I can hear her laughing." "She would have liked you," Jacob said. "You two are alike in some ways, both stubborn as mules when you set your minds to something." Grace laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Zell." "It was meant as one, Mrs. Zell." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. 20 years had passed since Jacob had stood alone beneath that oak tree, fresh earth at his feet and despair in his heart. 20 years of healing, of building, of loving again. "Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if things had happened differently?" Grace asked softly. If Emma had lived, if John hadn't fallen ill, Jacob considered the question carefully. "I used to. In those early days after Emma died, I tortured myself with what-ifs, but now," he shook his head, "I've come to believe that life unfolds as it should, even when it breaks our hearts along the way." "That's a rather fatalistic view," Grace observed. "Not fatalistic, faithful," Jacob corrected gently. "Faithful that even in our darkest moments there's purpose. Emma's death nearly destroyed me. But if she hadn't died, I wouldn't have been standing beneath that oak tree the day you brought flowers. We wouldn't have Emma Jean and Samuel. The school wouldn't exist, Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes, a tapestry woven from both joy and sorrow. Exactly. Jacob raised her hand to his lips. And I wouldn't trade a single thread of it, Grace. Not one. As the century drew to a close, the Wyoming they had first settled changed dramatically. The territory achieved statehood, the open range gave way to fenced pastures, and the railroad brought the wider world to their doorstep. The Zell ranch prospered, as did the school that bore Emma's name. Emma Jean, now 22, returned from college back east with both a degree and a fiancé, a serious young man named Michael who looked at her with the same devotion Jacob had once directed at Emma, and later at Grace. Samuel, at 18, showed no interest in ranching, his passion instead lying with the emerging technologies of the new century. When he announced his intention to study electrical engineering in Chicago, Jacob supported him without hesitation, remembering his own father's resistance to his Western dreams. In the spring of 1900, as the new century dawned full of promise, Jacob and Grace celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a gathering that brought together friends and family from near and far. The party spilled from their home onto the surrounding grounds, with tables set up beneath the stars and lanterns hanging from trees. During a quiet moment, Jacob found Grace standing alone beneath the oak tree, which had grown massive over the decades, its branches now creating a cathedral-like space over Emma's grave. Sneaking away from your own celebration, he teased gently. Grace smiled, reaching for his hand. I wanted to share this moment with her too. 25 years, Jacob. Sometimes I can hardly believe it. The best 25 years of my life, he said, drawing her close. Even better than your first years with Emma, Grace asked, a hint of her old insecurity showing through. Jacob considered the question seriously. Different, he said finally. What Emma and I had was young love, passionate, idealistic, untested. What you and I have built together has been forged through joy and grief, success and failure, raising children and building a community. It's deeper, Grace. Stronger, she leaned against him, satisfied with his answer. I've been thinking about something, the flowers. What about them? I've brought flowers to Emma every week for 25 years. That's over 1,300 bouquets. Grace looked up at the oak tree, its leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. I think it might be time to do something more permanent. And so, on the 25th anniversary of their marriage, Jacob and Grace planted a garden around Emma's resting place, a carefully designed array of perennials that would bloom in succession from early spring through late fall, ensuring that there would always be flowers beneath the oak tree. There, Grace said as they stepped back to admire their work. Now she'll have flowers even when we can no longer bring them ourselves. Jacob wrapped an arm around her waist, emotion thick in his throat. Thank you, he managed, for everything, for the flowers, for loving me enough to heal me, for giving me a second chance at happiness. Grace turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his, lined now with the evidence of their years together, but still as beautiful to him as the day she'd first approached him beneath this very tree. Thank you for being brave enough to love again, she said simply. Not everyone finds the courage. As they walked back to their anniversary celebration, hand in hand beneath the star-filled Wyoming sky, Jacob felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. For the life he'd built with Emma, brief though it was. For the 25 years and counting with Grace. For their children, their work, their community, the path had not been straight or easy. There had been heartbreak and loss, struggle and uncertainty. But standing here now, with Grace's hand warm in his and the sounds of their loved one's laughter floating across the evening air, Jacob Zell knew one thing with absolute certainty. It had all been worth it. The cowboy had buried his wife beneath the oak, and the neighbor woman had brought flowers every week. And somehow, in that simple act of kindness, they had both found their way back to life and to a love that would sustain them through all the seasons yet to come.